my beloved child. The last time they saw you, time slowed in a way they never expected, and what passed through their mind was not casual, not ordinary, not forgettable, but a silent collision of memory and realization that struck deeper than words. They noticed the smallest details first, the way your presence changed the air, the calm you carried without trying, the strength that did not announce itself yet filled the space. In that moment, they understood something they had been avoiding for a long time. They realized that you were no longer the version of you they once thought they knew. You had grown beyond the story they kept telling themselves. This realization unsettled them because it forced a question they were not ready to answer. Why did seeing you again feel like standing in front of a truth they could not outrun? They tried to mask it with a polite expression, but inside, their thoughts raced. They remembered the past, the words left unsaid, the chances missed, the assumptions made without understanding your depth. They saw confidence where there used to be uncertainty. They saw calm where there used to be noise. And in that instant, a quiet voice inside them whispered that losing you had never been as simple as they pretended it was. This was not admiration alone. This was recognition. Recognition that you carried something rare, something they underestimated, something they could not ignore anymore. What shook them most was not how you looked, but how you made them feel without speaking a single word. They expected indifference, maybe distance, maybe nothing at all. Instead, they felt exposed, as if you unknowingly held a mirror to parts of them they had hidden even from themselves. They thought about how you once listened when no one else did, how you stood firm without needing applause, how you walked away from chaos without bitterness. In that brief encounter, they realized that your silence now carried more power than any argument ever could. It frightened them because it meant you no longer needed their validation. They noticed that you were not seeking approval, not trying to prove anything, not asking for recognition. That independence triggered something unexpected inside them. A mix of respect, regret, and longing collided all at once. They asked themselves whether they had misjudged you from the beginning. They wondered if their pride had cost them something irreplaceable. And for the first time, they acknowledged that you had become someone they admired from a distance, someone whose presence commanded attention without demanding it. This was not nostalgia. This was awareness. Awareness that you had evolved, and that evolution made them question every decision that led to this moment. As they replayed that meeting in their mind later, the shock deepened. They remembered the way your eyes held steadiness instead of expectation, the way your posture reflected self-trust, the way you seemed grounded in a life that no longer revolved around anyone else's approval. They realized that you had done the work quietly, without announcements, without seeking sympathy. That realization humbled them. They thought about how they once believed you would always be there, always understanding, always patient. Seeing you now made them realize how wrong that assumption was. You had learned to choose yourself. You had learned to protect your energy. And that growth created a distance they could feel but could not cross. They asked themselves whether they would ever again meet someone with your depth, your resilience, your quiet strength. The answer unsettled them. Because deep down, they knew people like you do not come twice in the same way. That knowledge stayed with them long after the moment ended. It followed them into silence. It lingered in their thoughts when they were alone. It made them question whether they had truly understood what they lost, or if they had only realized it now, when it was already beyond reach. Later that night, the memory returned with even more intensity. They wondered what you were building, what dreams you were chasing, what peace you had created without them. They imagined the life you were shaping, and it made them feel both proud and uneasy. Proud because they could see your strength clearly now. Uneasy because they understood that you no longer needed them to witness it. They thought about reaching out, about saying something meaningful, about acknowledging the truth they had ignored for too long. But hesitation stopped them. Because they sensed that words alone would not bridge the gap that time and choices had created. They feared disturbing the balance you had earned. They feared hearing indifference where they once expected warmth. And that fear revealed the truth they could not deny anymore. They still cared. They still felt the weight of your absence. They still wondered what might have been if they had seen you clearly back then. That realization did not come with drama or desperation. It came quietly, firmly, leaving no room for denial. You had changed. And because of that, everything else had changed too. What they thought when they saw you the last time was not something they would ever say out loud, but it reshaped how they saw you forever. They understood that you were not just a chapter in their past. You were a turning point. You were the moment that taught them the cost of underestimating someone with a pure heart and unshakable strength. They realized that your presence had once been a gift they did not fully appreciate. Now, that understanding arrived with clarity, not confusion. They knew that seeing you again was not an accident. It was a reminder. A reminder of growth, of consequence, of timing. And whether they act on it or not, that moment will stay with them. Because some realizations do not fade. They settle deep, quietly transforming the way a person remembers, reflects, and understands what truly mattered all along. My beloved child. After that moment passed, something irreversible began inside them, something they could neither name nor silence, because seeing you again did not end when you walked away. It followed them. It sat beside them in quiet rooms. It returned when distractions faded. They replayed every second, every glance, every pause between words, searching for clues they had once ignored. What struck them most was not regret alone, but the clarity that regret brought. They realized that the version of you standing in front of them was forged through patience, loss, discipline, and self-respect. They saw the strength it takes to grow without bitterness, to heal without applause, to move forward without announcing victory. That awareness humbled them deeply. It forced them to accept that your transformation did not happen by chance. It happened because you chose yourself when others failed to choose you. That truth unsettled them because it meant you were never weak. You were simply becoming. And now, fully formed, you stood beyond the reach of their old assumptions. This realization landed heavily because it came too late to be innocent. It came with responsibility. It came with the understanding that some doors close quietly, not with noise, but with dignity. Something else troubled them even more as the days passed. They noticed how your presence lingered in their thoughts during moments of stillness. Not in a dramatic way. Not in longing filled with fantasy. But in a grounded, undeniable awareness that you represented something real. Something rare. They compared you, unconsciously, to everyone else they encountered. And in those comparisons, they found a quiet emptiness. Others spoke louder, tried harder, demanded more. Yet none carried the calm authority you possessed effortlessly. That contrast made them realize why being around you once felt safe, even when circumstances were uncertain. You had always carried a steady core. Seeing you again reminded them of that stability. It made them question why they had once overlooked it. Why they had mistaken consistency for simplicity. Why they had failed to recognize depth because it did not announce itself loudly. These questions did not seek answers anymore. They sought accountability. And accountability is uncomfortable. Because it forces one to confront the truth without excuses. And the truth was clear. You were never replaceable. You were simply misunderstood. As reflection deepened, they recognized something even more profound. You no longer carried the emotional weight they once placed upon you. You were lighter now. Freer. Untethered from expectations that were never yours to carry. That realization struck them with mixed emotions. Relief, because they saw your peace. Loss, because they understood they were no longer part of it. They noticed how you listened without absorbing, how you smiled without surrendering, how you engaged without attachment. These subtle shifts revealed how far you had come. You had learned discernment. You had learned boundaries. You had learned when to give and when to step back. That growth intimidated them. Because it meant you could no longer be taken for granted. It meant access to you now required sincerity, effort, and respect. They wondered whether they still possessed the maturity to meet you where you stood. That question lingered unanswered. Because deep down, they sensed that your life was no longer paused, waiting for clarity from anyone else. It was moving forward. Confidently. Intentionally. And that movement did not include hesitation. There was a moment when they almost reached out. Almost typed a message. Almost reopened a conversation. But something stopped them. Not fear of rejection. But fear of disrupting what you had built. They recognized that approaching you now required more than words. It required accountability for past blindness. It required honesty without expectation. And they were not sure they were ready for that level of truth. They understood that you would see through anything less. That awareness alone showed them how much you had changed. You were no longer someone who could be impressed by promises or swayed by emotion alone. You valued alignment now. Consistency. Action. And that realization forced them to pause. Because approaching you unprepared would not only be unfair to you. It would be dishonest to themselves. So they stayed silent. Not because they did not care. But because caring now demanded a courage they were still learning to summon. What they felt after seeing you the last time was not fleeting emotion. It was awakening. Awakening to the reality that some connections do not end because love disappears. They end because growth diverges. They end because one person evolves while the other remains anchored to an outdated version of the past. Seeing you again showed them that you had moved ahead, not angrily, not dramatically, but resolutely. And that image reshaped how they understood everything that came before. You were not someone they lost suddenly. You were someone they failed to recognize while they had the chance. That understanding does not fade easily. It transforms quietly, settling into memory as a lesson. A reminder. And no matter where life leads them next, the truth remains. The last time they saw you, they did not just see a person. They saw the consequence of timing, awareness, and the power of self-respect. And that realization will stay with them far longer than they ever expected. My beloved child. As time continued to move forward, the weight of that encounter did not lessen for them, it sharpened. Each day brought a new layer of understanding, a deeper realization of what your presence truly represented. They began to see that meeting you again was not coincidence, but contrast. A contrast between who they were then and who they are now. Between who you were becoming and who you have become. They recognized that your growth did not shout for attention, yet it commanded respect effortlessly. That quiet authority unsettled them because it reflected something missing in their own journey. They realized you had chosen discipline over comfort, truth over illusion, self-respect over familiarity. Those choices showed in the way you carried yourself, in the way you spoke without explaining, in the way you existed without needing acknowledgement. That realization forced them to confront a difficult truth. Growth changes people not only outwardly, but internally, and when two people grow at different speeds, understanding arrives late, often wrapped in silence. They noticed how your absence no longer created chaos, but clarity. And that clarity disturbed them. It revealed that you had been the steady presence they once leaned on without recognizing its value. They remembered moments when you offered patience instead of pressure, understanding instead of demand, loyalty instead of control. Seeing you again made them understand how rare that combination truly was. They compared those memories to their present reality and felt a quiet imbalance. Not because others failed to care, but because the care felt conditional, transactional, uncertain. You had never been that way. You had given from a place of integrity, not obligation. Realizing this made them question their own emotional maturity at the time. They wondered whether they had been capable of meeting you at your depth, or whether they had simply benefited from your strength without offering the same in return. That question did not seek forgiveness. It sought truth. And truth, once acknowledged, cannot be unlearned. There were moments when they felt admiration rise unexpectedly. Not admiration rooted in attraction or nostalgia, but admiration grounded in respect. They respected how you had rebuilt yourself quietly, how you had chosen healing without performance, how you had refused to let disappointment harden you. That strength reshaped the way they spoke about you internally. No longer as someone from the past, but as someone who had outgrown it. They recognized that you had stepped into a version of life where peace mattered more than validation, where alignment mattered more than attachment. That awareness made them realize why reconnecting felt complicated. It was not about desire alone. It was about readiness. And readiness requires humility. It requires accepting that you no longer fit into the role they once imagined for you. You had rewritten your own narrative. And witnessing that rewrite stirred something both inspiring and painful within them. They also sensed something subtle but powerful. You were no longer trying to be understood. You were simply being. That shift spoke volumes. It told them that you had released the need to explain yourself to anyone who could not meet you with genuine curiosity and respect. That realization hit deeply. Because it meant that any future connection with you would have to be earned, not assumed. They questioned whether they were prepared to show up differently, consistently, honestly. They questioned whether they could approach you without expectations, without entitlement, without the shadow of who they used to be. That self-examination was uncomfortable, but necessary. Because seeing you again was not just about revisiting a memory. It was about confronting growth that had surpassed familiarity. And growth, once recognized, demands transformation in return. What stayed with them most was the understanding that your presence had become symbolic. Symbolic of timing. Symbolic of choice. Symbolic of what happens when someone commits to their own evolution without waiting for permission. They realized that knowing you had changed them in ways they could not undo. You had become a reference point. A reminder of what authenticity looks like when it is lived, not spoken. Whether they ever cross paths with you again or not, that realization remains. Because the last time they saw you, they did not just see growth. They saw consequence. They saw the result of choosing yourself fully. And that image continues to reshape how they view connection, effort, and the quiet power of becoming someone who no longer asks to be chosen. My beloved child. As more time passed, they began to understand something that initially escaped them. Seeing you again did not reopen an old chapter. It closed one permanently. That realization arrived slowly, but when it did, it was undeniable. They recognized that the version of you standing before them was not carrying unfinished business, unspoken expectations, or lingering emotional debt. You were complete within yourself. That completeness altered the energy between you. It removed leverage. It removed familiarity. It removed the comfort of assumption. They felt it immediately, even if they could not explain it. You were present, yet unavailable to the past. Calm, yet unmoved by what once held power. This was not coldness. It was clarity. And clarity is intimidating to those who once benefited from confusion. They realized that you had stopped negotiating your worth internally. That shift alone redefined how they saw you. Because when someone knows who they are, they no longer ask to be treated well. They expect it. And that expectation changes everything. They began to reflect on moments they once dismissed. The times you chose silence instead of argument. The times you stepped back instead of forcing connection. The times you trusted your intuition even when it meant standing alone. Back then, those choices were misunderstood. Now, they made sense. They saw how every quiet decision you made had slowly built the strength you carry today. They realized you were never passive. You were discerning. You were never distant. You were protecting your energy. This awareness unsettled them because it reframed the entire narrative they once held. It showed them that you had always been ahead emotionally. They were simply catching up. That truth carried weight. Because it meant the distance between you was not caused by misunderstanding alone. It was created by growth happening at different times. And timing, once missed, does not rewind. What affected them most was recognizing that you no longer carried resentment. There was no bitterness in your presence. No need to prove anything. That absence of resentment revealed your strength more than anger ever could. It showed that you had processed the past fully. That you had taken responsibility for your healing without waiting for apologies that never came. They admired that, quietly. Because letting go without closure requires courage. It requires choosing peace over validation. And seeing you embody that choice forced them to examine their own unresolved emotions. They realized that while you had moved forward, parts of them were still negotiating with old versions of events. That imbalance became clear in contrast to your grounded energy. You were not rushing. You were not waiting. You were simply aligned. And alignment does not invite chaos back in. There was also an unspoken understanding that settled between you. A recognition that reconnecting would not mean resuming where things left off. It would require building something entirely new. That thought intimidated them. Because new beginnings demand accountability, consistency, and emotional presence. They wondered whether they were prepared to meet you at this level, where excuses hold no value and effort speaks louder than intention. They sensed that you would no longer tolerate half-truths or emotional uncertainty. That awareness alone created hesitation. Not because they lacked feeling, but because feeling without maturity is no longer enough. They recognized that you had outgrown dynamics that drain rather than nurture. And that realization made them pause. Because approaching you now would require them to rise, not reminisce. In quiet moments, they accepted a truth they could no longer avoid. Seeing you again was not meant to restore the past. It was meant to reveal growth. Yours, and theirs. It was a reminder that some people enter our lives to show us who we can become, not to stay forever. You had fulfilled that role, even without trying. And now, your presence stands as proof that transformation is possible when one chooses self-respect over familiarity. Whether paths cross again or remain separate, that understanding remains etched in them. Because the last time they saw you, they did not just see change. They witnessed the result of someone who chose clarity over comfort. And that image continues to reshape how they understand connection, timing, and the quiet strength it takes to move forward without looking back. My beloved child. Eventually, they stopped asking themselves why seeing you again affected them so deeply, because the answer became unavoidable. It was not about attraction, nostalgia, or unresolved emotion. It was about truth. You represented a truth they could no longer escape. A truth about growth that happens quietly. A truth about people who leave not to punish, but to protect their spirit. When they finally allowed this understanding to settle, something inside them shifted. They realized that you were not a loss in the dramatic sense. You were a lesson that arrived wrapped in grace. A lesson about awareness arriving too late, and the humility required to accept that timing cannot be negotiated. They understood that the calm you carried was earned, not inherited. It came from nights of reflection, moments of disappointment, and choices made without applause. And standing in front of that calm forced them to acknowledge how little they had truly known about strength when it does not announce itself. That realization stayed with them because it dismantled old definitions they once relied on. They could no longer confuse familiarity with depth, or comfort with compatibility. Seeing you again corrected that misunderstanding permanently. They began to notice how your absence had quietly reorganized their inner world. Without you there, certain distractions no longer worked. Certain excuses no longer held. They recognized that when you were part of their life, you brought balance without demanding attention. You held space without control. You supported without erasing yourself. Losing access to that presence revealed its value too late to preserve it. And that awareness did not come with self-pity. It came with responsibility. Responsibility to admit that they had benefited from your steadiness without fully reciprocating it. Responsibility to accept that your growth was not a reaction to them, but a commitment to yourself. That distinction mattered. Because it meant your transformation was never about proving anything. It was about alignment. And alignment does not wait for recognition. It moves forward quietly, confidently, and without regret. There were moments when they wondered if they would ever meet someone who carried the same depth without demanding reassurance. Someone who understood silence without misinterpreting it. Someone who valued consistency over intensity. Those reflections made them realize why you stood apart in their memory. You had never needed to be dramatic to be meaningful. You had never needed to compete for space. You simply existed fully, authentically, and that presence had shaped them more than they realized at the time. Seeing you again activated that understanding. It showed them that real connection does not create dependency. It creates stability. And stability, once lost, reveals its worth only in hindsight. That truth did not make them desperate. It made them honest. Honest about what they overlooked. Honest about what they learned too late. Honest about the fact that growth cannot be reversed once it has taken root. They also recognized something quietly powerful. You no longer needed to be remembered the way you once were. You were not attached to old narratives. You were not defined by what happened or what did not. You had stepped into a space where your identity was self-authored. That independence redefined how they perceived you. It removed the illusion that you belonged to a shared past. You belonged to yourself. And that ownership changed the dynamic entirely. They understood that any future connection, if it were ever to exist, would require meeting you without expectation. Without entitlement. Without assumptions rooted in who you used to be. That realization carried weight. Because it meant the comfort of familiarity was gone. In its place stood respect. And respect demands consistency, presence, and emotional accountability. They questioned whether they were prepared for that. And the fact that they asked themselves that question at all showed how deeply you had influenced their awareness. In the end, what they thought when they saw you the last time became clear to them in a single, quiet sentence they never spoke aloud. You were never meant to stay the same so they could remain comfortable. You were meant to grow, even if that growth meant leaving them behind. That understanding did not bring sadness. It brought clarity. Clarity about timing. Clarity about choice. Clarity about the quiet power of someone who chooses themselves fully and unapologetically. And that clarity will remain with them, shaping how they approach connection, effort, and self-awareness from this point forward. Because some encounters do not exist to rekindle the past. They exist to reveal the truth. And the truth they saw when they looked at you for the last time was undeniable. You had become someone who no longer waits to be understood. You simply are.